Imagine a society where your right to just absolute, uncompromising cultural uniqueness is legally protected.
Yeah.
Like, it's literally protected as sacred.
Right.
You can govern your community, you can speak your language, build your local economy however you see fit, with zero interference from, some global homogenizing force.
Yeah, total autonomy.
But there is one unmoving catch to all of this. If your unique culture crosses one specific line, if it violates a single foundational rule, the global system instantly drops you.
You're just cast out.
Exactly. You are out. So
Right.
today we are opening a document that claims to have solved the paradox of global peace.
Which is a massive claim.
It's a huge claim.
Yeah.
And strangely enough, it requires you to look at world politics not as a chessboard, not as a corporate boardroom, but as a late-night, chaotic, intensely disciplined jazz club.
I mean, it is a profound mental shift. If you're listening to this right now, you already know the tension of the modern world. You feel that constant friction
Oh, absolutely.
between wanting to maintain your unique identity, your local community's way of life, and the crushing, homogenizing weight of a globalized system that, frankly, seems to want everyone to look, think, and consume exactly the same way.
Yeah, just buy the same coffee, use the same apps.
Exactly. So the text we're looking at today is called the Peaceful World Manifesto version 1.0.
And it is dense.
It's an incredibly dense 40-point sociological blueprint. But, and this is important, we aren't going to skim all 40 points today.
No, we don't have the time for that.
Right. If you want to understand the architecture of this proposed world, you really only need to put a microscope over one specific paragraph.
Point 18.
Point 18. It is titled The Wedge is Jazz, with the subtitles Sovereignty and Polyphony.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we are going to isolate point 18 entirely. We aren't going to, pull in concepts from the rest of the manifesto.
Put blinders on.
Just focusing on this one section.
Well.
Because the internal logic of this single paragraph contains a complete functional operating system for human interaction.
It really does. But to parse that operating system, we have to clear up a massive cultural misunderstanding right out of the gate. We have to talk about what jazz actually is.
Right. And the Russian instructional notes for today's deep dive made a very specific request about this. They said we need to explain the actual philosophy of jazz.
Yeah, because there's a big disconnect there.
Totally. Because if you aren't a musician, if you just hear the word jazz, you probably picture one of two things.
Yeah.
You either picture pleasant, harmless elevator music,
Of background noise at a cafe.
Guessly. Or you picture a chaotic free-for-all. Like a bunch of guys in berets got on stage, closed their eyes, and just started violently attacking their instruments with no plan.
Just absolute noise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would actually push back on the idea that even musicians fully grasp it unless they've actually played it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That chaotic free-for-all stereotype is the exact opposite of what is actually happening on a jazz stage.
It looks chaotic, but it's not.
Right. Jazz is arguably one of the most mathematically rigorous and structurally demanding art forms ever created.
Wow. Okay.
The Manifesto didn't choose a marching band, and it didn't choose a punk rock show. It chose jazz because of the specific mechanical tension between strict boundaries and absolute freedom.
So break that mechanism down for us. How does a jazz ensemble actually function mechanically without just collapsing into pure noise?
Okay, let's look at the anatomy of a standard jazz performance. You have a group of individuals who might have never even met each other before walking onto that stage.
Wait, really? Just strangers playing together?
Oh, all the time. It's called a jam session.
Yeah.
And they don't have sheet music that tells them exactly what notes to play at exactly what millisecond.
Right. No central script.
Exactly. What they have is an agreement on a framework. Before the song starts, they agree on a key signature, a time signature, and a chord progression.
Okay.
That chord progression, the sequence of underlying harmonies, is called the changes.
So the changes act as, the invisible cage.
Well, I wouldn't call it a cage. I call it a scaffolding. It loops continuously.
A scaffolding. Okay, I like that.
Yeah. Now, within that scaffolding, the musicians play the head. That's the main recognizable melody of the song.
The part you can actually hum.
Right. But once the head is played, they move into the core engine of jazz, which is improvisation.
This is where the solo happens.
Exactly. One musician takes a solo. They are inventing a completely new melody in real time, right on the spot.
Which is terrifying, if you think about it.
It is. But, and this is the crucial part that explains the entire political philosophy of point 18, they are not playing random notes.
They aren't just mashing buttons.
No. They are mathematically calculating their improvised melody to weave perfectly through the underlying chord changes as they happen.
Oh, wow. It's basically high-speed architectural design.
That's a great way to put it.
You are, like, building a house while simultaneously living in it. Okay. But you have to obey the laws of physics. The chord changes or the house collapses.
Exactly. But here's where it becomes a model for a global society. While the saxophone player is soloing, what is the rest of the band doing?
Just waiting for their turn.
No, they aren't just waiting. The pianist is comping. That means playing chords to support the soloist, but they're reacting to the soloist's mood.
Oh, so it's active.
Very active. If the saxophone gets aggressive, the piano plays heavier, more dissonant chords. The drummer is listening to the rhythmic phrasing of the soloist and dropping snare hits to accentuate the saxophone's specific ideas.
So they are constantly adjusting.
Yes. This requires a state of hyperactive, exhausting, real-time listening.
So it's a feedback loop.
Yeah.
The soloist pushes, the band reacts, which changes the environment, which forces the soloist to react to the new environment they just created.
Yes. You cannot be a selfish player in jazz and survive.
You just get kicked off the stage.
Pretty much. If you stop listening to the people around you, you will fall out of the chord changes, you will lose the rhythm, and the music turns into a catastrophic train wreck.
Right.
The freedom to solo is entirely dependent on your rigorous, hyper-vigilant connection to the collective framework.
Okay, so translate this into the sociological blueprint of point 18, because this is fascinating.
Yeah.
If traditional human history empires, globalization, forced assimilation, if all of that is a classical symphony.
Right, where a single conductor at the front of the room holds the only copy of the master score.
Yeah, and dictates every single breath the musicians take. Then this manifesto is proposing a geopolitical framework based on real-time adaptation.
It is a radical departure from the political scripts we're used to.
Total.
Historically, when cultures collide, the dominant culture demands that the subordinate culture learn their sheet music.
Speak our language, adopt our economic system, wear our uniform.
Exactly. The manifesto argues that this model is obsolete and ultimately destructive.
So what's the alternative?
It demands a world where you maintain your distinct instrument, your distinct voice, but you are required to fiercely listen to the cultures around you.
You have to leave space for their solos.
Right, while everyone adheres to an underlying structural rhythm.
Which brings us to the first major conceptual stake the text drives into the ground.
Let's hear it.
Point 18 opens with a definitive, almost aggressive statement. It says, "We reject forced unification. The true world is a pluriversum, built on complexity, not simplification."
That is a loaded sentence.
It really is. Let's look at that word, simplification. Because on the surface, keeping things simple sounds like a good thing.
Yeah, usually it is.
Right. If you are running a business or organizing your life, you want simplicity. So why is the manifesto treating simplification as a toxic concept for global society?
Because in the context of governance and sociology, simplification is almost exclusively the mechanism of authoritarianism and erasure.
Erasure. How so?
Well, think about how a massive empire or a hyper-globalized corporate structure operates. They cannot handle complexity because complexity is unpredictable.
And it's probably incredibly expensive to manage.
Extremely expensive. If you have 100 different local communities, all with their own dispute resolution systems, their own local currencies, their own agricultural calendars based on their specific microclimates.
How does a central government tax that?
They can't. How does a global corporation sell a standardized product to that?
They don't. It's an administrative nightmare. The spreadsheet just breaks.
Right. So what does the central power do? It simplifies. It forces unification.
It paves over everything.
Exactly. It paves over the complex indigenous agricultural system and replaces it with a single massive monoculture crop.
Like planting millions of identical corn stalks.
Yes. It eradicates the local dialects and mandates a single national language. It replaces local dispute resolution with a standardized federal legal code.
It's trying to make everything readable to the people at the top.
Yes. This is what the anthropologist James C. Scott famously called making a society legible. You simplify the human ecosystem so you can control it.
But the manifesto explicitly says the true world is built on complexity. They aren't just tolerating complexity.
No, they are saying it is the foundation of reality.
And they introduce this brilliant linguistic pivot to describe it. They call it the Pluriversum.
Pluriversum, it's a great word.
We've spent our entire lives using the word universe.
Yeah.
Universe, one song, one reality.
Right.
The concept of the universe implies that ultimately there is only one correct way for things to be, and all competing systems must eventually merge into that single truth or be destroyed by it.
And the Pluriversum shatters that assumption.
The text actually defines the Pluriversum as a world in which many worlds fit.
It is the ultimate rejection of the single sheet music.
Yeah.
It posits that an indigenous tribe in the Amazon, a hyper-technological metropolis in East Asia, and an agrarian collective in Eastern Europe are not just different stages of human development on a single timeline.
Right, one isn't behind the other.
No, they're distinct parallel worlds. And a healthy global system doesn't try to merge them into a single gray average world.
Because that just ruins everything that makes them unique.
Exactly. It builds a framework where those radically different worlds can coexist in the same space without eating each other.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there and play devil's advocate.
Go for it.
Because I think anyone listening to this is immediately going to spot the logistical flaw here.
The chaos problem.
It sounds beautiful on paper, many worlds fitting into one world. But mathematically, if you have 100 different cultures with vastly different values competing for the exact same global resources, doesn't complexity just naturally degrade into chaos?
The valid concern.
Like, how is a pluriversum not just a recipe for endless, paralyzing tribal warfare?
That is the exact fear that drives people back into the arms of authoritarianism, that fear of chaos, the assumption that complexity equals chaos.
Right.
But let's look at the natural world. Look at a coral reef or an old-growth forest. A forest is staggeringly complex. You have tens of thousands of different species of fungi, plants, insects, and predators, all violently competing for sunlight and nutrients.
Yeah, it's not a peaceful place.
No, they are not unified. They are highly distinct. But a forest is not chaotic. It is a highly resilient, deeply integrated system.
Because the friction between the species creates the balance.
Exactly. Now compare that old-growth forest to a commercial pine plantation where humans have applied forced unification.
Okay, so just endless rows of identical pine trees.
Right. The plantation is simple. It's just one type of tree planted in perfectly straight rows. It's highly organized. But what happens when a single specific beetle infestation hits that plantation?
The entire forest dies in a month.
Yep.
Because there's no genetic diversity to act as a firewall.
Precisely. The simplicity makes it fragile. The complexity of the old-growth forest makes it anti-fragile.
Wow, that's a really powerful analogy.
And the Manifesto is demanding we apply this ecological reality to human civilization. By trying to force all of humanity into a single universe of thought or economic structure, we are building a cultural pine plantation.
We are making ourselves incredibly fragile to systemic collapse.
Yes. The Pluriversum, the jazz ensemble with all its differing instruments and intersecting melodies, is how you build a globally resilient human species.
Which flows perfectly into how this actually operates politically.
Let's get into the mechanics.
Because point 18 calls this state a living polyphony. And then it introduces a specific mechanism for governance.
Right.
It says, we practice deep democracy. We hear and integrate voices of minorities and marginalized groups, understanding that they carry a piece of the collective wisdom.
Deep democracy.
Yeah. We all know the fatal flaw of standard majoritarian democracy. If 51% of people vote to do something, the 49% are functionally silenced until the next election.
You just lose.
You lose. Tough luck. But what's wild to me here is how the Manifesto attacks this. It doesn't attack it as a moral failing, but as an epistemic blind spot.
That is the crucial distinction you have to grasp.
Break that down.
In most political discourse today, making room for marginalized or minority voices is framed as an act of charity or political correctness or historical guilt.
Right. The majority says, okay, we will give you a seat at the table so we look inclusive.
Exactly. The Peaceful World Manifesto completely throws that out the window.
Yeah.
Deep democracy argues that listening to the margins is a matter of hard, cold survival data.
Because the text literally says they carry collective wisdom.
Yes.
So explain the mechanics of that. Why does a marginalized group possess wisdom that the majority inherently lacks?
Because of how systems distribute friction.
Friction, okay.
If you belong to the 51% majority, if the culture, the economy, and the laws were built by people who look and think like you, the system works for you.
It's designed for you.
Right. It's frictionless, and because it works for you, you become structurally blind to its flaws. You literally cannot see the cracks in the foundation because you don't live in the basement.
Oh, that's good. You are playing the melody, so you don't notice the stage of rotting.
Exactly. But the marginalized groups, the people pushed to the edges of the economy or the culture, they live intimately with the friction of the system.
They feel every bump in the road.
They feel the cracks. Therefore, they possess an epistemic advantage. They have actual tactical data about reality that the majority cannot access.
Let's ground this in a practical scenario for the listener, because this is super important.
Sure.
Imagine a city planning committee trying to solve a flooding issue. The committee is made up of wealthy urban planners who live on the high ground.
Right.
They look at the map and decide to build a massive concrete culvert. It makes perfect engineering sense to them. But they practice shallow democracy, so they outvote the neighborhood association from the poor district located down in the valley.
And what happens? The concrete culvert accelerates the water runoff, and because the planners didn't understand the specific, localized soil absorption rates that the valley residents have dealt with for 50 years...
The valley floods twice as fast.
Exactly. The project fails.
But under deep democracy, the city planners don't just tolerate the valley residents' complaints. They realize they literally cannot solve the equation without their variable.
Right. Deep democracy operates like the polyphony in a jazz band.
How does polyphony work exactly?
So in polyphony, you don't just have one melody and a bunch of background singers harmonizing with it.
Okay.
You have multiple independent intersecting melodies happening at the exact same time. The trumpet is playing one tune, the trombone is playing a counter tune. It creates a rich, complex texture.
So no one is just singing backup.
Exactly. In our city planning scenario, the marginalized group isn't just adding a harmony to the majority's plan. Their input acts as an entirely new melody that forces the majority to alter their own tune.
Because if they don't, it sounds terrible.
Right. Integrating their collective wisdom prevents the system from designing fatal errors. Deep democracy isn't about being nice. It's about building a society that doesn't continually blindside itself.
But wait, we're back to the chaos problem.
Are we?
Yes. If you have all these distinct civilizational codes, and you have deep democracy encouraging every minority group to play their own independent melody as loudly as possible, what actually stops the Pluriversum from tearing itself apart? Because it sounds like it would just devolve into noise.
This is where point 18 introduces the linchpin of the entire document, the rhythm section.
Okay. The text says, the general rhythm is set by the ethical minimum, but the melodies of cultures can be unique.
The ethical minimum. This is the bass player and the drummer of the geopolitical jazz club, and it is the most vital mechanism in the Manifesto.
Let's really dig into this, because this is where the theory hits reality.
It is.
In a jazz band, you can play a deeply dissonant chord on the piano. The saxophone can play outside the established scale. It might sound weird, but it's acceptable.
It's part of the expression, yeah.
But what happens if the bass player decides to suddenly play at half speed? Well, the drummer decides to speed up.
The music physically disintegrates. The human brain cannot track it anymore, and it ceases to be music. It just becomes noise.
It falls apart completely.
The freedom of the jazz soloist is 100% reliant on the absolute uncompromising rigidity of the rhythm section maintaining the tempo and the groove.
So the ethical minimum is the metronome of this future society.
Exactly.
But what exactly is the mechanism of this metronome? Because we are dealing with a massive philosophical war here. Universalism versus cultural relativism.
Let's define the stakes of that war. Cultural relativism, taken to its absolute extreme, argues that no culture has the right to judge the morality of another culture.
Right.
If an indigenous society practices something we find abhorrent, the strict relativist says you cannot judge them. That is their unique civilizational code.
And universalism is the exact opposite.
Right. Universalism, on the other extreme, argues that there is one single objective moral framework, and every single human on Earth must obey it.
Which is usually defined by whichever empire is currently in power.
Precisely. The marching band again.
Yeah, everyone wears the same uniform. So how does this manifesto handle that?
Point 18 strikes a highly calculated middle path. It fiercely defends the right of a culture to have a unique melody, their own language, their own family structures, their own spiritual beliefs.
Correct.
But it draws a hard line against absolute relativism by stating that all melodies must adhere to a general rhythm.
And that rhythm is the ethical minimum.
Yes. The ethical minimum is a non-negotiable baseline of human dignity and basic rights. The Manifesto is saying, we don't care what instrument you play, we don't care what scale you use, but you will stay on the beat.
And if they don't, what if a culture's specific historical melody involves, I don't know, systemic oppression?
Yeah.
What if their tradition dictates that women cannot own property or that a specific caste of people must be used for forced labor?
Under the framework of Point 18, that culture has officially stopped playing jazz.
They're offbeat.
They have broken the tempo. Systemic oppression isn't a unique cultural melody. It is an offbeat catastrophe that ruins the entire jam session.
And this is where I have to push back hard.
I know exactly what you're going to ask.
Who defines the ethical minimum? Because historically, the people who get to define universal ethics are just the people with the biggest military.
Of course.
How does the Manifesto prevent the ethical minimum from just becoming a new tool for Western imperialism or Eastern hegemony?
That is the danger, and the Manifesto's structural defense against that is the concept of compatibility, which is the next sentence in the text.
Right, let me read it. Point 18 states, we ensure compatibility of our system with different cultural codes. Globalization must not erase cultural identity.
The mechanism here is fascinating. They use the word compatibility, not uniformity.
What's the difference in this context?
To understand how you enforce an ethical minimum without becoming an imperialist, you have to look at computer engineering.
Okay, lay it on me.
Think about application programming interfaces, or APIs.
Let's build a USB-C interface rule. Explain this.
Think about all the wildly different pieces of hardware in the world. You have a massive, hyper-complex server farm running on Linux, and you have a cheap, tiny digital camera running its own proprietary, very simple operating system.
Right. Two totally different things.
Internally, their wiring, their code, and their purposes are completely alien to each other. They possess different civilizational codes, to use the Manifesto's term.
But they need to talk to each other. The server needs to download the photo from the camera.
Exactly. Now, the imperialist approach, forced unification, would be the server saying to the camera, in order to connect to me, you must delete your internal operating system and install Linux. You must become exactly like me.
Which destroys the camera. It wouldn't even work anymore.
It ruins it completely. But the compatibility approach, the Pluriversum approach, uses a shared interface protocol. Let's call it the USB-C standard.
Okay.
The server doesn't care how the camera runs internally. It doesn't force the camera to change its core identity. It simply says, when you communicate with the global network, you must format your data to fit this specific, universally agreed upon interface.
So bringing this back to human societies, the ethical minimum isn't an empire dictating how you live your internal daily life. It's the API.
Yes, it's the translation protocol.
That is such a cool way to think about it.
The Manifesto is demanding that global institutions stop trying to rewire the internal cultural DNA of different societies.
Right.
You can have a deeply religious, agrarian society that operates on communal land ownership. You can have a hyper-secular, hyper-capitalist tech hub.
Two completely different worlds.
Yes. And the global system should not try to force the agrarian society to become capitalist, nor should it force the tech hub to become communal.
Because that would be forced unification.
Exactly. The global system's only job is to be the interface, to provide the shared protocols of trade, environmental protection, and basic human rights that allow those two radically different worlds to interact safely.
So as long as your internal code is compatible with the ethical minimum at the point of contact, your internal culture is left entirely alone.
That's the promise of the Pluriversum.
It's a profound way to look at the concept of the global citizen. Because right now, being a global citizen usually implies being a rootless cosmopolitan.
Yeah, like you belong nowhere.
It implies you've shed your specific local traditions to just become a generic node in the global economy.
Just a consumer.
Right. If you're listening to this, think about your own community. Maybe you have deep religious roots, or a specific regional dialect, or a fiercely guarded local tradition.
And maybe you feel that terrifying pressure that globalization is just paving over it.
Turning your town into a replica of every other town with the exact same chain restaurants?
It's a real fear.
The Manifesto is offering a framework of psychological safety. It promises that you do not have to give up your deep, localized civilizational code to participate in the future.
You just have to ensure your code has an API that doesn't harm anyone else.
Which brings us to the grand finale of Point 18. The absolute unmoving boundary of this entire philosophical experiment.
The bass drum.
We've talked about the ethical minimum as a concept, but the final sentence of this paragraph defines the core of that minimum. It defines the ultimate limit of the Pluriversum.
Let's read it exactly as written.
Okay, here it is. The right of a people to identity is sacred. Under the sole condition it must not violate the fundamental human right to life.
Boom.
The music stops.
Yeah. That is not a suggestion. That is a concrete wall at the edge of the jam session.
It's so absolute.
It is the loudest strike of the bass drum in the Manifesto. It solves one of the most difficult philosophical puzzles in political science, the paradox of tolerance.
Right, the idea formulated by Karl Popper. If a society is completely, unconditionally tolerant of everything, it will eventually tolerate intolerant people.
Who will then seize power and destroy the tolerant society.
Right, so a tolerant society must paradoxically be highly intolerant of intolerance.
Exactly. And the Manifesto solves this by creating a brutal hierarchy of values. Notice the specific language it uses.
It calls the right of a people to their cultural identity sacred.
Yes. That is incredibly strong sociological language. It's elevating cultural uniqueness from a political right to an almost spiritual imperative.
But then it instantly subordinates that sacredness to something even higher, under the sole condition.
It must not violate the fundamental human right to life. This is the ultimate limit of cultural relativism.
The absolute boundary.
If a culture says, our sacred tradition requires human sacrifice, or our civilizational code dictates that we wage aggressive war against our neighbors to conquer their land.
Or, our legal system requires the execution of political dissidents.
The Manifesto's response is, your tradition is void. Your code is broken. You are out of the band.
Yes. Life is the highest sacred value, period. It sits at the absolute peak of the hierarchy.
You cannot use culture or tradition as a shield to end human life. If your melody requires the death of another human being, the rhythm section stops playing and the global system actively rejects you.
But I have to challenge the physical mechanics of this. It's a gorgeous sentence. It's theoretically flawless. But how does this actually work in reality?
This is the tricky part.
If the global system is built on a pluriversum, many worlds fitting into one, and one of those worlds suddenly decides to start executing its own citizens,
Right.
how does the global system intervene without instantly becoming the exact, simplifying, forced unification empire that it swore to destroy?
It's a great question.
Do the other jazz musicians jump off the stage and physically attack the offending player? Does the global system send in an army? Because if it does, isn't it just dropping bombs in the name of peace?
That is the ultimate razor's edge of the Manifesto. And while point 18 doesn't detail the military logistics that's handled in other protocols of the document, the structural implication here is about systemic isolation, not necessarily imperial conquest.
Isolation. Okay, explain that.
If we stick to the compatibility API metaphor,
Yeah.
if a computer virus starts destroying hardware, the network doesn't nuke the offending computer.
Right, it doesn't drop a bomb on the server farm.
It severs the connection. It quarantines the node. If a civilizational code violates the right to life, it loses its compatibility privileges.
It gets unplugged.
Yes. It is cut off from the global polyphony, the trade, the shared resources, the protection of the Pluriversum. The system makes it economically and socially impossible to sustain lethal practices because the offending culture is starved of the network's lifeblood.
Oh, wow. It's an immune system response rather than an imperial invasion.
Exactly. An immune system doesn't try to teach a virus how to be a healthy cell. It just blocks it from utilizing the body's resources.
The global jazz ensemble doesn't force the lethal culture to learn a new song.
No, it just turns off their microphone and stops letting them use the club's electricity.
Okay, we have taken a massive journey today. And we did it by putting a microscope over just a few sentences. Point 18 of the Peaceful World Manifesto.
It's dense, but it's brilliant.
We've seen how the world as jazz is not just some catchy, poetic fluff. It is a rigorous, demanding, and highly technical blueprint for human survival.
It demands the preservation of unique civilizational codes. Those are the solos, the distinct melodies. It demands that those differing codes be integrated through deep democracy, constantly listening to the epistemic wisdom of the margins that is the polyphony.
The intersection of all those tunes.
And it demands that this entire complex, beautiful, fragile mess be anchored by an uncompromising ethical minimum.
Where the right to life is the absolute baseline rhythm.
Exactly.
If you are listening to this right now, I want you to pull these massive geopolitical concepts down into the room you were sitting in.
Bring it home.
This isn't just about how the United Nations operates. This is an operating system for how you interact with reality.
Yeah, think about your workplace, your neighborhood council, your own family.
Are you operating like an empire? Are you demanding a marching band?
Are you trying to force unification through simplification because it's easier for you to manage, effectively silencing the complexity around you?
Or are you building a Pluriversum? Are you using the USB-C interface rule?
Right. Standardizing the basic ethical boundaries, the respect, the right to exist safely, while fiercely protecting the right of the people around you to operate on their own internal codes.
The ultimate challenge of point 18 is that it asks us to look at the terrifying complexity of 8 billion humans not as a problem to be solved,
And not as a messy spreadsheet to be cleaned up into binary black and white lines.
but as a masterpiece to be harmonized with. It requires the exhausting, hyperactive listening of a jazz musician.
It takes work, real work.
So, as you step back into your day, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought. If the world truly is a jazz ensemble, and the rhythm is the universal right to life,
What instrument are you playing right now?
and more importantly, are you actually listening to the complex melodies of the people playing right next to you, or are you just waiting for your turn to solo?
Keep listening.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.